In January 1945, approximately 2,400 Australian and British prisoners of war were held at Sandakan POW camp in British North Borneo, today Malaysia Sabah. They had been there since 1942. They were starving. They were sick. The Japanese garrison holding them was preparing, for reasons military historians have debated for 8 decades, to march them into the jungle. 6 Australian soldiers survived to see the end of the war. 6. Out of 2,400 men, 6 walked out of the Borneo jungle alive. All 6 survived not by completing the marches but by escaping into the jungle and being sheltered by local villagers. Every prisoner who remained in Japanese custody at Sandakan and on the march routes died, from starvation, disease, execution, or the specific violence the garrison directed at prisoners too weak to continue. The Sandakan Death Marches are the worst atrocity suffered by Australian military personnel in any conflict. They produced more Australian deaths than Gallipoli, more than Kokoda, more than any single engagement in any war Australia has fought. They occurred in 1945, in the final months of a war Australia was winning, to men who had survived 3 years of captivity and died within reach of the end. They are not in the school curriculum the way Gallipoli is, nor commemorated nationally on the same scale. Families of the dead have spent decades fighting for recognition that has come slowly and always inadequately. This video covers the men who died, the conduct of the garrison that killed them, the failures of Allied command that left them without rescue, and Australia's cultural choice to commemorate some tragedies over others. Stay to the end. Number 1 asks why Australia chose Gallipoli as its foundational military narrative instead of Sandakan, and what that reveals about which stories we keep and which we let fade. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Let's begin. Sandakan, a port city on Borneo's northeast coast, was the capital of British North Borneo when Japan captured it in 1942. The POW camp there was one of the largest in the Pacific Theatre, holding Australians captured at the fall of Singapore and British prisoners transferred from elsewhere. They were sent to build an airstrip. Under conditions that deteriorated steadily through starvation rations, disease, and guard brutality, they built it, then watched Allied bombing destroy it. By early 1945, the airstrip was unusable and Borneo's strategic situation had changed. What happened next is the central question. Number 12. The men who died at Sandakan were captured at Singapore in February 1942. The fall of Singapore is itself one of the most significant events in Australian history. Its implications for the Australia-Britain relationship never fully processed publicly. Singapore was believed impregnable. British defences assumed attack from the sea. The Japanese came overland through supposedly impassable jungle. On February 15, 1942, what Churchill called Britain's worst disaster and largest capitulation, General Percival surrendered to General Yamashita. About 130,000 Allied troops became POWs, including roughly 15,000 Australians. The Australian 8th Division, sent to defend a fortress commanders knew was indefensible, went into captivity that February. Some worked the Thai-Burma Railway, some went to Japan, some to Sandakan, a selection that, for many, meant the difference between survival and death. Number 11. The camp, built by the prisoners themselves in 1942, held at its peak roughly 2,400 Australian and British prisoners, the largest such concentration in the Pacific outside Japan itself. Conditions deteriorated systematically from 1942 to 1945, following a pattern driven by reduced food rations, rising forced labour demands, the brutality of particular guards and commanders, and the progressive failure of medical infrastructure against diseases, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, cholera, that thrived in the camp's conditions. By 1944 and into 1945, rations were at starvation levels. Men who had entered captivity at healthy weights were, by the final year, skeletal, working on insufficient calories while performing forced labour that demanded far more than their bodies could sustain. The medical situation was compounded by the deliberate restriction of medicines. The prisoners' own medical officers, Australian and British Army doctors who had gone into captivity with their units, documented what was happening in records some managed to conceal and preserve, at significant personal risk, for the day the war would end and the evidence could be produced. Some of those records survived. They are held at the Australian War Memorial, documenting in clinical medical language the deliberate production of conditions designed to kill. Number 10. In January 1945, the garrison ordered, the exact command structure remains contested, prisoners marched into Borneo's interior. The first march began January 28, a second in May, a third in June. The stated purpose was clearing the coast ahead of expected Allied landings, a plausible rationale given the advancing Pacific campaign. But this doesn't explain the march's character: the hardest available route, inadequate food, execution of anyone who fell rather than evacuation, and a pace exceeding what starving, diseased men could sustain. Historians offer two, non-exclusive interpretations: a deliberate death program designed to eliminate witnesses to Sandakan's conditions, or a reflection of Japanese military doctrine treating surrender as dishonorable and its victims as deserving contempt. Either way, the outcome was the same. Number 9. The 6 survivors escaped rather than completed the marches. Their post-war testimony, corroborated by Borneo villagers who witnessed the columns, is the primary record. The accounts are specific and consistent. Prisoners unable to keep pace were shot, bayoneted, or beheaded, often before other prisoners, rather than left or evacuated. Survivors testified the purpose wasn't discipline or preventing escape, it was ensuring none reached the end alive. Physical conditions were catastrophic: starvation rations, unmanaged malaria, and dysentery. Men who'd survived 3 years dying within days of the march starting. Villagers' testimony to Allied investigators, on prisoner condition, guard conduct, and bodies left on the track, corroborated the survivors. The route was the site of a war crime of extraordinary scale, documented in Australian war crimes investigation files. Number 8. The 6 were Privates Keith Botterill, Nelson Short, Owen Campbell, Herman Ryther, and Richard Braithwaite, and Warrant Officer William Stickpowich. Each escaped the march column and was sheltered by Borneo villagers until Allied forces arrived. Their escapes were acts of desperation. Death on the march seemed certain, the jungle only marginally safer. That all 6 survived reflects the critical assistance of the local population, who sheltered them at extraordinary risk. Japanese reprisals against assisting villagers were severe and documented. That courage has never been adequately acknowledged in Australia. All 6 testified to war crimes investigators immediately after liberation, forming the evidentiary basis for later trials. Their consistency across separate investigations established Sandakan firmly in the official record, making later public ignorance a cultural choice, not an evidentiary gap. Number 7. Australian investigations began in 1945, producing trials in 1946 to 47. Several Japanese officers and soldiers were tried, some convicted and executed, others imprisoned. Captain Hoshijima Susumu, the camp's commander for much of its operation, was tried, convicted, and executed in 1946, the highest accountability achieved. But full command responsibility, who actually ordered the marches, and whether officers above Hoshijima bore unprosecuted responsibility, was never resolved. Many guards who directly executed prisoners were never identified or tried. Destroyed Japanese records limited prosecution beyond senior command. The accountability delivered was genuine, partial, and less than the crime warranted. Number 6. Deliberate restriction of camp communications meant families received sparse, outdated, often misleading information, occasional supervised postcards, sometimes nothing at all, leaving many unsure whether their men were alive. Post-war death notifications carried a specific horror. Men who'd survived 3 years had died not in combat or from ordinary captivity disease, but executed or abandoned on a death march. This grief was compounded by the Australian government's slowness, citing operational security and ally sensitivities, in disclosing full details. The complete account emerged gradually through trials, survivor testimony, and sustained family advocacy. Some families never learned exactly how or where their men died. Number 5. Every April 25th, hundreds of thousands attend Anzac Day dawn services nationwide, commemorating the 1915 Gallipoli campaign's roughly 8,700 dead, the foundational narrative of Australian military identity. Sandakan receives a fraction of that attention. No national commemoration day, no equivalent dawn service naming its 2,400 dead. Local memorials in Borneo and among families are genuine but don't approach Gallipoli scale. This is not primarily a resource question. It is a narrative question. Gallipoli fits a specific story about Australian military identity. Men who fought bravely under difficult circumstances, defeated by odds and factors outside their control, maintaining courage and mateship through adversity. A story about agency and character in the worst circumstances. Sandakan is a harder story. It is a story about men who were starved to death, marched until they fell, and executed when they fell, prisoners, not combatants, whose deaths were produced not by battle but by deliberate atrocity. It does not fit the agency and courage narrative as comfortably as Gallipoli does. Australia has chosen, consciously or not, to build its military identity around the story that fits the national narrative better. The 2,400 men of Sandakan paid for that choice with their place in the national memory. Number 4. By early 1945, Allied intelligence knew of Sandakan's deteriorating conditions. Whether a rescue was seriously considered before the marches began remains one of this story's most painful questions, and historical findings are uncomfortable. Factors shaping the lack of action included Pacific strategic priorities elsewhere, Borneo's secondary status, the operational complexity of rescue in enemy territory, and incomplete knowledge of the disaster's true scale. These are real factors, but they don't fully explain why 2,400 men died while forces capable of reaching them prioritized other objectives. Families have pressed this question for decades. The implicit, never formally stated answer is that their men's lives were weighed against strategic priorities and found insufficient. Number 3. Public memory has been sustained by 4 groups: the 6 survivors, whose testimony formed the initial record; the families, who kept memory alive without institutional support; historians, whose work from the 1980s onward restored broader awareness; and the Borneo community, whose connection never diminished. Historian Lynette Silver's research in the 1990s 2000s substantially expanded public knowledge. The 1992 documentary Remember Sandakan and the 1994 book and television production based on her work brought the story to Australian audiences, prompting letters from families who'd never known the full truth, and from Australians hearing of Sandakan for the first time. It has been remembered by those with personal reasons and by researchers, not by national institutions, curricula, or the commemoration calendar, the way Gallipoli has. Number 2. The Sandakan Memorial Park in Sabah, established 1999 on the original campsite, is maintained by Malaysia and visited by growing numbers of Australian families and veterans. It is among the few places the story is told in its proper geographic context, the jungle and remnants of camp infrastructure conveying, physically, the remoteness and isolation in which 2,400 men spent 3 years before dying. The Anzac Day Dawn service there has grown since the 1990s, reflecting rising awareness, though never on Gallipoli scale. The Borneo community's descendants of those who sheltered the survivors have remained specifically generous toward Australian visitors, a generosity Australian public culture has never adequately acknowledged. Number 1. Gallipoli is taught because it fits the story Australia wants to tell about itself: courage, sacrifice, mateship, genuine in foundation, simplified in telling, and institutionalized over a century because it's useful, heroic, tragic, morally legible. Sandakan does not fit this story as well. The men of Sandakan were not defeated in battle. They were murdered while in captivity, by a captor eventually defeated by forces that did not reach Sandakan in time to save them. Their story does not yield the same agency and courage narrative. They died not demonstrating the Anzac spirit, but as victims of a war crime on a scale Australian institutions have never fully acknowledged. Teaching Sandakan properly would require teaching several things that are uncomfortable for a national narrative: the failure of Allied command to prioritise the rescue of men in captivity, the specific character of the deaths, produced by deliberate atrocity rather than the fortunes of war, the cultural choice to commemorate some military deaths more than others, and the question of what it means to have a national military identity built partly on a story selected for its narrative. Usefulness. These are not things school curricula typically want to teach. They are precisely the things a serious engagement with Australian history requires. 2,400 men. 6 survivors. Australia still doesn't teach their story the way it deserves. That is a choice. Choices can be changed. Share this video. Subscribe. Read the histories. Visit the memorial if you can. And the next Anzac Day, remember Sandakan. See you in the next one.